question is about your vision for providing low-cost housing for millions of Filipinos, and what your views on non-governmental organizations like Habitat for Humanity and Gawad Kalinga that's very much concerned on this social problem.
Okay, the participation of non-governmental issues on a government program such as housing is very, very welcome. And as much private sector participation as possible is fine. I mean, you encourage it, but it is not an essential solution to perhaps a structural problem that you have to solve. What do you have to do? Number one, again, is to provide job opportunities so that people can avail on a sustainable basis of government supported cheap housing mortgage facilities. On a sustainable basis, I say, because with more permanent jobs, they can have access to two things: institutional housing support, which has a contribution on the part of the worker too, because you cannot have a moral hazard anyway. You have to have some risk participation. And socialized healthcare, which is sadly lacking in our country. So that is the challenge, employing more people so they can be formally recipients of sustainable housing programs in partnership with the private sector. I think that yun ang punot dulo niyan. Because you can have housing, but if there's no income to support the housing or to pay up the cheap housing loan, even student loans for that matter, you fall flat on your face. You'll have the next generation of rundown dwellings. Now, there is a problem back. Here in Metro Manila, the socialized housing must be medium rise. It cannot be any more single dwellings. Must be medium rise.
The follow-up of that is what is your thoughts, or if you're in the become president, is the policy on informal settling, which is a very big problem here in the capital.
There are two things that you can do. Number one is to supervise and monitor the local government units very closely and tell them not to add more. To refuse actively through community participation additional informal dwellers. No? Okay? Because sometimes it's also the lack of vigilance, if not sometimes in certain areas, actual complicity of barangay officials. That's why informal settling happens. Number three, you should also try, the problem is also a question of opportunities. Even if you resettle them, they had the experience in the Balik Probinsya program. The Balik Probinsya program of government will give you 3 times monthly minimum wage. 60 days, I think, of minimum wage if you go back to your province. They were escorted, I think some people from Mindanao were escorted to the boat, but when they got out of sight in Manila Bay, they jumped into water, came back. Babalik at babalik eh. And not only is that a problem here, but I was reading this morning, China is faced with that kind of the most massive urbanization or urban migration that any country in history will ever face, happening in China. That's why they're leading in energy investments right now, because they're going to have a power gap. So with us, I think we should really be thankful in one sense that urbanization is not as brisk, and there is still time to cure its ills or to plan adequately for it in other areas. Of course, Metro Manila is a different case. But informal settling as a policy should not be condoned, because it is not merely a hazard to physical infrastructure, but more importantly, a hazard to the people living in these informal structures to themselves, particularly those who don't have an intelligent choice, meaning to say the children. They're the first at risk. No? But having said that, it's easier than having to do something about it. because actually you will have to physically relocate them and provide sustainable means of livelihood for them. And then what is essential is that the government has the capacity to do that only for a limited amount of people, and it does not grow in size and in scope that the amount relocated becomes half of those that migrate in. It must be controlled, it must be stopped. There are several legal and constitutional problems though. We have the freedom to travel anywhere and settle anywhere in our country without limitations. That is a fundamental right. And you cannot, I think even the Supreme Court has said you cannot forcibly relocate people from one area to another. There was a case in 1930 or 1940 where a mayor deported prostitutes from Manila to Davao. And at that time, the American Supreme Court, American-dominated Philippine Supreme Court already ruled that you can't do that. There's no law allowing any person under a regime to do that. And so that is a difficulty. You have to have their voluntary consent. They can get out of their shanty, they can't live there, but you cannot tell them to go to Bulacan or whatnot. They can just go on the street and wander around. It's their right. You can't force them not to walk in the streets. It's their God-given right to do so. That's a problem.
Thank you.